Well, looks like people are filtering in, so I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to the webinar, Taking on Racial Bias in Child Welfare, brought to you by the Imprint and sponsored by Accenture. For those of you who don't know Accenture, Accenture is a global management consulting and technology firm providing a broad range of services to child welfare agencies across the globe. Accenture brings continuous innovation to help government improve the outcomes they get for vulnerable children and their families. And you can visit www.accenture.com/child welfare to learn more. I'm Daniel Heimpel, the president of Fostering Media Connections and the publisher of The Imprint, a national news site covering child welfare and juvenile justice, which until August of this year was called the Chronicle of Social Change. I'm joined today by a terrific panel of guests to take on a critical examination of racism and racial bias in America's child welfare system. As we all know, on May 25th, George Floyd was killed by Minnesota police, suffocated to death under the knee of a sworn law enforcement officer. His death sparked a much needed and long coming national discussion on race and policing. Clearly, this is not a discussion confined to policing alone, though. 1 out of every 2 Black children in America will be investigated as potential victims of abuse by the time they turn age 18. From there, the state has incredible power. While the child welfare system is quote unquote a legal system, child welfare investigators and the courts have the power to separate children from their families, a power that many have rightly called the civil death penalty, and one that is disproportionately levied on Black and Native children primarily. About 14% of the nation's children are Black, but Black children make up 24% of youth in care. A major study in California found that by age 5, 14% of all children had been referred to Child Protective Services as possible victims of abuse or neglect. For Black children, that worrisome number stood at 30. Some of this disproportionality can undoubtedly be sourced to racism and disparities that occur far upstream of the child welfare system before a CPS investigator ever knocks on a door. But research has also laid bare that bias exists within the system as well. A Texas study of decision point data found that when you control for income and risk level, Black children are 20% more likely than white children to be involved in a case that is open for services. And once they are 77% more likely to be removed in lieu of in-home services, 77% more likely. Today, we're going to first talk to Molly Tierney, head of Accenture's Child Welfare Division, about her time as the head of child welfare for the city of Baltimore and how her experience there shaped her views on the presence of racism in the system. We will also hear from Jessica Price, director of the Florida Institute for Child Welfare, and Corey Best, community curator for Mining for Gold LLC, about 2 very different paths to erasing racial biases within the system. I thank Molly, Jessica, and Corey for all being here today. We will hopefully, and I will work to make sure that we get time at the end of our program for questions. So if you have them, start entering them into the chat box, and we will get to those as best as we can. So with that, I'm going to call up Molly. My first guest is Molly Tierney. She spent 25 years in the child welfare. You may have caught her 2014 TED Talk, Rethinking Foster Care, which I think changed a lot of people's minds about the system that we all are heavily engaged in. And now she leads the child welfare work at Accenture. Just so you all know, Molly and I have known each other for probably 15 years, 10 to 15 years. I remember her as a hard-charging director in Baltimore and thought she was cooler than anything, brought her up to DC to have some briefing because she was figuring things out. So Molly, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to see you, Daniel. Thank you.
It's great to be with you, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. It's not an easy one. Just to say it, my mother was born in Iraq. She's a refugee from Iraq, but my father's German. So I am considered by everybody a white man. I'm a white man. I'll say that to start with. but race, racial bias, equity, diversity, and inclusion are a near constant topic of conversation these days across systems, and interpersonally. Why do you think it's important for this discussion to be happening in child welfare now?
Good question. I feel like this is the work of our time, right? Healing the sort of gaping racial wound in our country. There's really nothing in my mind more important than this. And as you aptly noted, these sort of racial disparities exist across all public systems. So I don't think there's something uniquely wrong in child welfare. I think something's happening in public systems in our country where they are doling out their resources and consequences along a color line in a way that turns out to be sort of staggeringly unfair. But so while it's not only happening in child welfare, the fact it is happening in child welfare, and we ought to all be digging in on how to be anti-racist in the places where we're living, moving, and working. And so I feel like coming to understand more how it makes itself known in child welfare is the right first step. You know, my experience in Baltimore was the ease with which we all tolerated less for Black and brown kids, the way we all assumed they needed the protection of child welfare from their families, just sort of baked into the system. And having a longer period of time to reflect on that, I feel like it's very important that we're taking up this conversation at the level of the concept, right? Black Lives Matter, full stop. It's important that we're taking it up at the level of policy, like how can we sort of be thinking about where policies might be pulling us against our value system, values of things like equity. I feel like the additional work that I want to make sure we don't miss is we have to get these ideas to get legs and walk around, right? It's not going to be enough just to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, because that's never changed the world, right? I think really coming to understand, building our muscle to speak about race. And I appreciate your comment. I'm a white woman. I appreciate you naming it. We have to be able to talk about these things in heterogeneous, we have to talk about race and experiences of race in heterogeneous groups without escaping the topic, which is what America loves to do. We exit stage left. We find some reason to change the subject. And we have to do it while everyone's still with us. Like, we can't do that on the backs of the people that leaves behind. Now's the moment to get into an inclusive way of thinking about that on behalf of the Black and brown kids that are coming to child welfare.
Well, I will say, Molly, you know, on this transactional level, the human level, you know, I am guilty of, and I wrote about this some time ago, not wanting to understand that racism and bias on an individual level could be driving the disproportionality of the system to the degree that it does. And so I looked at data that suggested that there were disparate needs was the driver of the disproportionality. And it is true that there are disparate needs, and there is an inequity riven through every single system. But because I looked up to people like you and other people in child welfare systems, it was hard to imagine that their bias was creating a system that was separating Black families at a much more rigorous rate. And you know, we've talked about this before, Molly. Social workers don't go into the system waking up saying, hey, I'm going to snatch a Black baby today. But something happens when they're out in the field. You know, what's going on with that? You were running one of those systems.
Yeah. Well, you know, I totally agree with you that child welfare is full of very good people who are getting up every day and acting on their beliefs and their values and notions about caring for children. And yet we end up with the data that you started this conversation with is we care about all children, but we tend to do this damaging work, the separating kids from their parents more frequently along a color line. Now, I do want to say, early on in this conversation, you said the systems have bias in them. And I actually think, I'm not sure bias exists in systems. I think systems are nothing more than groups of people. And groups of people have bias in them, but we are all moving at such a fast pace that we lack opportunities to stop and notice. In the moment of the transaction, in the moment when I'm engaging with someone, how can I understand my race and my experience of my race, your experience of your race, and the space that's sort of between us? How can I come to understand that space? And because that's how bias works, right? So fast in our minds, so fast, right? You can't even grab the tail of the thing. And the kinds of biases that have our country making decisions along racial lines are embedded in myths about people of color that our country has been digesting for hundreds of years, right? And so I sort of feel like the pathway out of that for the well-meaning child welfare workers who get up every day to do good by kids and families is giving them the opportunity to slow down and understand their own thinking and how they're developing opinions, and when they may be getting pulled off the question by a trigger is not quite the right word. Corey or Jessica would have a better way of saying that. Something that's triggering their bias. I think we have to find ways to increase the time between stimulus and response when we're making decisions about what's happening for kids. So we're always asking, and in what way is race playing into my decision? And can we just have that conversation? And I'm an Ibram Kendi student. Yes, I'm a racist, you're a racist. Let's talk about it. Let's own it, know it, and heal.
Well, you've had more opportunity to learn. And on a personal note, you adopted Delilah, who is a young Black girl from the foster care system.
Correct.
And that's changed a lot in terms of your perceptions. I mean, how does it change the way you think that Black children are treated across all Black children in America, not just those in the child welfare system?
Well, there's sort of nothing more, being a mom, being a dad, I assume, being a parent changes everything. It just, it changes everything. And I think that my experience, I went from understanding a lot about child welfare. I fancied myself an expert on child welfare. And I fancied myself a person who cared a great deal about equity and inclusion and racism, and all of those things were true. And that was still sort of at a professional, almost intellectual level. And then I became a mom, and that's just real different. It is now close to the bone, and I understand it in a primal way now. And what I see every day is how the literature leaps off the page in terms of opportunities, access, assumptions about my perfectly spectacular 11-year-old, that the world experiences her as older than she is, right? They ascribe to her more negativity than they would ascribe other kids. I trust you, she's the one getting the yellow card on the soccer field, right? For doing less than many other children have done. She is, I could go on and on about how powerful my experience of that is, including the tremendous challenge of being a white woman with no experience being a Black person, preparing a person who is Black to be a Black person in America. That is a mountainous journey that I had not conceived of before, and it gave way to my understanding of what I think I intuit Black parents have been feeling for hundreds of years is, oh God, my child's leaving the house. How can I keep her safe? There's so many things to worry about before you can worry about the things that on the other side of the color line that are usually the first 5 things you've read about. It's yeah, it is a heart-wrenching journey. I wouldn't have it any other way, you know, but it's a heart-wrenching journey. And you're right. It increased the sort of fervor I have on this topic for all kids in our country.
Well, I mean, you have a perch now that's different than the perch you had before. I mean, you know, you've told me that you were so prone for battle in the day-to-day of running a child welfare system, and so focused on redistributing power to the people that were so disempowered by this service agency that you didn't realize that you were in part of something that was structurally built to do what it did, and what you so eloquently talked about in your 2014 TED Talk. I hope John or Talia will put up that TED Talk in the chat.
Yeah.
You have to see it. You know, now you're at a perch where you're looking across the country, and, you know, in the couple minutes we have before we turn it over to Jessica for real concrete solutions, but, you know, how are you moving forward to make sure that we're having the kind of conversations that change the individual, so that they aren't run by the biases that you now experience as the mother to a girl?
Well, I think, you know, Daniel, in part it's conversations like this. We cannot be having conversations about child welfare without having conversations about race. We just can't. There's no venue or topic we should be covering where we're not naming it, coming to understand it, and taking cold, hard looks in the mirror. I think, as I said before, engaging in complex conversations to understand it more is the task at hand. I feel very fortunate. If you and I had this conversation a year ago and you had said to me, hey, Molly, what are the top 5 pressure points in child welfare? As you talk to directors across the country, I would have named them, right? Like child fatalities, I don't have enough foster parents, families first, like they would have had a list, right? And race and equity would not have made the list, and it is on the list now. It is top 5 now everywhere I go in the country. And I think that's, of course, not going to solve the problem, but man, that's a great start, is we're naming it as a priority. And the thing to do very quickly thereafter is get to, and what are specific concrete things we can do so that we do not miss the chance to swing at this ball by only thinking about it. We can't just think about it, we have to do. And that is why I am such a huge fan of both Jessica and Corey. They're singing my song is we can get specific, we can get transactional about precise things that we can do that will have, that will show rapid cycle improvement on a thing we need to move on expeditiously.
Well, Molly, you're going to stick around.
Yeah.
I have a one note from David Arnold. Thanks, Molly, for your willingness to learn the culture of your adopted daughter. This will truly be a journey, but your heart is in the right place. So thanks, David, for sharing that. You know, the chat, I'm very happy to see that it's moving brilliantly. We're tabulating these questions and we'll get back to them as best as we can. So, but I want to move from the messiness of the messiness of bias on the interpersonal level to what Jessica is going to be talking about. And some concrete actionable strategies being used to roll back racism in the system. And so in 2011, Nassau County, New York began what may be America's first race-blind approach to making the most critical decision in child welfare, whether or not to remove a child from his or her parents. Jessica Price, are you here? Thank you for joining us. Is the director of the Florida Institute of Child Welfare, and she's going to walk us through that Nassau County experiment. And Jessica, go for it.
All right, thank you so much for having me. So as stated, I used to work at the University at Albany, and my job was to evaluate municipalities around New York State that were trying to address racial disparity. And on that journey of traveling to 14 different areas of New York State, I went to Long Island, New York, and met an amazing team of leaders in Nassau County. So when I got into Nassau County, we were talking about the data and why the leaders felt it was so important to do what they decided to do. The Black population was 13%, but the youth in care who were Black were 56%. So I always call Maria Lowry a courageous leader, and I want to share a quote from her. She essentially said, "It was shockingly bad," and she's referring to that data. "Personally, I would use the word ashamed. At the time, I wondered, why is it so bad? We had to try something." So what they started doing was training. They wanted to go step by step to bring this lens of implicit bias, but also the historical context around systemic racism. And they decided to blind a removal meeting that they already had. They had a standing removal meeting regularly. This was something they did as a standard. So what they did was started to redact information. It went like this. So a caseworker went out as normal, and they did their assessment and did their interviewing and did their initial risk assessment. But then they came back to the office if they had safety concerns. They went into a room with a blind removal committee meeting and talked about the case. But the difference is they didn't talk about the names, they didn't talk about addresses, they didn't talk about race. They focused on three main elements. Family history was one of them, but only relevant history. They talked about, of course, the allegation. Why did we get called? What actually happened? And the third component was really that family strength, protective factor, capacity to protect realm, talking about what can we do to insulate this family to keep them safe together. Okay. So I think it's important to also talk about when Maria Lowry and her team brought this idea to the team, there wasn't a lot of buy-in. There was some apprehension. People said, we're not a racist. And we know we've heard that before. People said, I'm not coming here making decisions, trying to harm Black kids. Like it was said earlier from Molly and Daniel, I don't think that people come in or wake up in the morning and decide to do that. But I do want to share a couple of quotes from caseworkers that I interviewed during the process. We interviewed caseworkers, their supervisors, middle managers, and directors, and the commissioner on how this impacted their work. So one of the quotes says, "When I see a case from a certain apartment building or a zip code, I automatically start to think the worst." So they started to realize that this blind removal process really did essentially nullify the impact of their biases. Another quote from a caseworker: "When a family has a history with our agency, many of us hold that history against them, even if they're trying to do things differently." So I found it really profound and transparent of the caseworkers to talk so candidly about how this had transformed how they talk about families. It was really sharpening their decision-making skills because they were focused in on the right information. So now let's talk about what this did to the data. In 2011, as we already talked about, the kids in care that were Black were 56%, but tracking the blind removal meetings for 5 years brought us to 2016, and it brought the number to 29% of Black children being separated from their families and placed in foster care. Pretty staggering, pretty exciting, and I know that the team in Nassau County are still implementing blind removals and working hard to bring more data so that they can continue to show us the sustainability and efficacy of the pilot. So happy to answer any questions you might have.
There are a lot of people chiming in here. I think Jessica, I mean, it's pretty stunning. You still have obviously heavy disproportionality, but what has been the reaction since this information came out? Have you seen other jurisdictions picking up on this? Is it gaining currency?
So many people have reached out and they're interested. I think that it really takes this approach of trying to figure out how to adapt it because, for example, Los Angeles being the largest child welfare agency, I believe the largest one in the country, they were interested in blind removals, but but the idea of doing a meeting for the volume of cases they had seemed tedious and not feasible. So a lot of people are interested, but they're really trying to be adaptable about it. Can we do a blind or redacted conversation over the phone? Can we start making our conversations about families in a more targeted way, even if it's not a formal removal meeting? But there is a lot of traction. And I think that at this point, people are working to at least experiment and do a pilot.
I'm getting a question from Hannah Bowie. How do we advocate to our child welfare agency to adopt the blind removal process? Who do we advocate to?
So I would say, I always talk about leadership. I think that as a researcher and a fallibilistic researcher, I believe in experimentation. I believe that's how you impact adaptive problems. You use adaptive solutions and you experiment. So again, as a researcher, I think that if you were to go to your leaders and say, can we pilot this? To me, if the data is working and we're able to, again, nullify the impact of this bias that we're talking about, keep going. If it doesn't make an impact, or it's tedious, or it is it's disrupting your flow of work, then you pivot to something different.
Jessica, I mean, we're going to come back to this, and there's going to be a lot more questions clearly, but I want to get Corey in here. And so Corey, you know, the blind removal process that Jessica just talked about focuses on the strategy of removing race from the equation at decision time, essentially removing the ability of people to bring bias to the table. In Broward County, Florida, where you're working, leaders took a different tack, using data to expose bias practices and counter them directly. And you, Corey, you've been one of the child welfare leaders involved in that Broward project. And can you explain to us how the county has had massive gains and your strategy there?
Absolutely. And thank you for the invite. I won't belabor it because of time. I want to jump right in and say that, you know, in Broward, we've recognized that it's imperative, if we are able to achieve any semblance of equity, that we make our systems visible. And what I mean by that exactly is we've come to realize that our struggle is a struggle of ideology, right? And what we do in our systems often reflect our institutional phobias. And that goes back to Molly's original point. You know, we are creating a system where families become more and more dependent upon us, and that system is oppressive. So we feel that the only way around is straight through. So therefore, removing blinders, being color bold, being color consciousness, because we have firmly understood that colorblind methodology is similar to racist ideology, where it avoids the acknowledging of the continuing existence of structural and institutional racism, which brings me to a hack or an experiment that we did in Broward, where you can see from the data that the population for Black children 0 to 18 is 33%, yet and still the children in care are upward 61%, and that includes, you know, a disparity in poverty. So we focused on two primary communities within Broward. And again, understanding that this is a heavy lift. So we're cramming 500 years of information into a 10-minute sound bite. It will not do justice, but to begin, it took a group of courageous leaders to recognize that what the data was saying to us. So depending upon worldview, the disparity data or the poverty data can tell one side of the story, where, to your point, Daniel, that it's a need of the community, right? That it's a disparate need. So we can justify the removals of 20 to 25 children in 2018 November and link that to poverty. But the data really begins to tell another story as we begin to deepen our analysis of truly what racism is. This is not something that we can, as Molly says, sing kumbaya. We can all be friends. We can make pseudo communities all we want. We can go through all the anti-bias trainings that we need to. It's not going to make a dent into the structures and the institutions that govern our practices, because we have associations. We, even in Black body, automatically believe something is often morally deficient about Black and brown communities. And we saw that come out in the data. And we began to ask different questions. What drives the disparities? What do we need to eliminate? What do we need to focus on? What new systems do we need to create? And how might we continue to disaggregate this data? So our number one priority was to begin to look at that baseline and say, okay, at point of entry, meaning at investigation, we can't control the hotline. At investigation, what does the workforce need in order to mitigate or reduce the disparate numbers? So that brings us to the community. And just hold on to that number. I'm talking about 20 to 25 kids being removed per month. And this is a unit of 6 individuals out of a 14-unit division of CPS. So we're talking about 6 individuals, 1 supervisor, removing 20 to 25 kids. It took the community to come together and begin to center the perspectives of our communities. That's our parents, that's our youth, and that's our staff. So we also had conversations with our investigators, courts, nonprofits, and our prevention networks. Through that, we collected a harvest. That harvest said that families wanted to have certain characteristics in the way that they were being treated by the workforce. So what's important here is that equity also means centering the experiences of those that are most harmed, burdened, or traumatized by our systems. And that's exactly what we did. Community and parents became a part of that process. So we established through a race equity work group 3 primary goals to help us govern the practices at the Broward County Sheriff's Office. Again, BSO could not do this alone. So the first goal is to think about institutional accountability for families. What does that mean? What does it look like? Accountability in this work is not punitive, because what we don't want to do is fall into the trap of replicating oppressive systems. So we thought about accountability as a way to coach, model, and sort of coach up to the behaviors that we want to see in our systems when it comes to the relationships that we build with Black and brown families. The second goal was authentic family engagement. We've heard it across systems, right? Family engagement, family involvement. PTA nailed it in the 70s. What does it mean? What does it look like, especially with the most challenging families? Because when we're able to see the attachments we have added to race without being blind, we then are able to see that it's the workforce's responsibility to engage families differently. So therefore, we created Authentic Family is really prioritizing relationships over services, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The third goal was, and still is, to cultivate and continue to churn and cultivate a family engagement advisory board where families who are actively even going through the system and the community will be able to give voice and lend their expertise to solution-oriented tasks. The strategy we utilized was a methodology that we nailed through a hypothesis. So the hypothesis was, with increased authentic family engagement, that families would feel more supported, valued, and seen, and that they would have more robust protective capacities to care for their children. So we created, out of those conversations I mentioned a few slides ago, a values-based assessment that comprises of, basically, for those of us who know the social work credo, meet families where they are, that's social work credo 101. But when I ask families, or workforce rather, what does that look like in practice? No one can tell me what it looks like in practice. So what we've done is we've extracted 9 values: caring and compassion, altruism, self-awareness, diversity, cultural humility, effective communication, humility, inclusion, and transparency. Those are the values that families, meaning parents, said they want from their workforce. we attached sample practice indicators and we folded it into a coaching model. We utilize a parent feedback survey to ensure that parents are being treated with dignity, because what we've seen in child welfare is that treatment and lack and de-investment into families is what ultimately creates some of this tension, or it's a variable to what creates some of the tension. We pulled together a coaching model. So we took those same 6 investigators that were removing 20 to 25 children per month, and we put them in an incubator. This incubator surrounded them with anti-racist thinking. It surrounded them with the historical context. It surrounded them with how they automatically associate certain things that are ultimately negative to Black and brown families. And it's also become this revelatory space where the workforce actually recognize and adhere to their biases with the help of their supervisor. Training is probably the very smallest piece of this. The ongoing relationship building is what's necessary. And for families, we also have flexible funding. So what we see through concrete support, building protective factors in the workplace, coaching staff, getting in the moment feedback from families, and utilizing a framework that measures authentic family engagement, we now have this pilot unit that has investigated over just about 2,500 children in the year, in 31 removals. So to make that simple, since 2018, we started in 2019. You saw those 20 to 25 removals from January 1, 2019 to October 1, 2019. The same group of investigators had removed only 17 children. What's uniquely important about that is that the community didn't change. The family dynamics didn't change. Their Blackness didn't change. Their phenotype didn't change. Their habits didn't change. What changed was the way we saw families. And so now that leads us to some comparison. We have the 2463, 957 removals. So out of 21,230, only 957 removals. That's a 4.5% removal rate. And then as we go down, we continue to see that the numbers within the non-pilot, same time period, 1,083 investigated, 145 removed. So what you're seeing now is that this entire unit division, they received protective factors training, but they didn't have the exposure to the coaching, the values-based assessment, and a deepening of an analysis of what racism is and how to see it, not to run from it, to see it. The other piece is that we are really looking at safety outcomes, because we have to adhere to what the federal government wants, right? We're still bombarded by the system. So what we've seen is we've looked at the rate of non-recurrence of safety within 6 months. And so the pilot unit is really shining bright here in Broward. 2018, 95.38, and also here in 2019, 95.9%. So that's well above the state benchmark for safety outcomes. And I will say too that I wasn't planning this, but as of yesterday, like I just got this data, if you see me looking at my phone, I just want to let you know that the month of September 2020, 105 investigations in this same unit, and we've had staff turnover. So it goes to show that one lever pulled can impact even newcomers, because we're creating conditions. See, focusing on the interpersonal piece only does a little harm reduction, right? Prejudice reduction, bias reduction. Focusing on collective action gives us this opportunity to create new conditions. Zero children removed in 30 days out of 105 children investigated. So I would say in sum that I am really encouraging individuals to recognize that we shouldn't think in linear terms and linear hierarchical terms, meaning, because that's a replication of the power, meaning what's most important here. What's most important for me is to say that we're in a moment of reconstruction, right? We have failed deconstruction. We're in a moment where we all can play a role. Not one person can do it all, but everybody can do something. And that's really what I want to leave with today. So I believe we have some time for questions, comments.
Yeah, Corey, thank you so much. I mean, people are, the writing, the numbers are amazing. This is very impressive, and it is very impressive. Quick question for you, and Jessica and Molly, please turn on your cameras because I'm going to open up the conversation for all of us to jump into. So welcome back. But Corey, Broward is unique in that the CPS investigations unit is part of the police department, correct? It's not part of the child welfare system, right? So,
Well,
and it's a 6-person unit. Was that a benefit, or did that, what kind of wrinkle was that?
so it's always a wrinkle. I mean, come on, I'm just going to speak it real with you. You're talking about bringing police to the Black community. I mean, that's already a lack of trust, right? So each of these removals, it's statutory. So this is how we must begin to look at our structures. This statutory requirement that in the 7 counties that have law enforcement removals, that these investigations, these child welfare investigations, are accompanied by a law enforcement with a gun and badge. The BSO workers investigate maltreatment with just the star on their shirts and the high-tech boots, which is still, right? Families really don't care if you like law enforcement or not. If you look like them, you are one, right? But they also recognize that you have the power to remove their children. So I think it's critically important to recognize that within a militarized system, in a community that has very little trust about law enforcement and sharing power, that even still, that was one of the major hurdles, and also consideration. Should we start there? Should we put some parameters around the types of cases that we look for? But what we see, again, it's not the families that have necessarily changed, it's the workforce. So the institution is changing and creating new conditions where families are feeling a lot more seen.
Well, the interesting part is that it's within the police system, and obviously
Yes.
child welfare system is presents itself as a service system, but is really police like at the investigation stage and the monitoring afterwards. But what's interesting is you're able to change, essentially, this is revelatory not only for the field of child welfare but for policing, what you're finding there, Corey. I got a question for that the incomparable John Kelly, who's senior editor at the Imprint, came up with. And this is for both you and Jessica, you and Corey. And Jessica, maybe you can start. But so there's 2 different ideas at play here, right? Authentic engagement training aimed at preventing foster care and removals, and removing demographics from a group that made the call when it did come up as an option. So your blinding example, is it feasible to mix and match those 2? And you're obviously a researcher, Jessica, so you'd know how to study it, but is it possible to mix and match those ideas?
So I think it is. I think that because blind removals is only at the decision-making point, whether a family is being separated, then one could do a project where that decision is still blinded, but the intensive nature of what Corey's talking about, a different way you view a family, approaching them differently, would happen after the fact. Because we know that even if a family isn't separated and a child's placed in foster care, sometimes they are under surveillance and they're monitored by our system. And that approach to culturally sensitive services and partnering with them around relevant case plans could really bring what Corey just talked about. So that's a way to merge it if people were wanting to do both.
So I would, if I have to pose an answer, and Jessica and I are friends, right? So she knows where I stand with the colorblind. There's a visceral reaction there when I hear colorblind anything, perfectly honest. So to me, I feel that one, you have to recognize your community's willingness. In Broward, because of where they are with their analysis, asking them to do anything that sort of erases race would not be well received, right? But what I could see for other communities who are embarking upon journey of discovery and understanding of, even if racial biases exist, that potentially blind removals could be done as a study to sort of mirror what's happening internally with individual workers, to use as a training opportunity, because I'm concerned for the families in Nassau County that this is just a decision point. But when they leave that system, there's the bus stop, there's the school, there's the judge, there's the case manager. So we're still driven in our racial biases. So how are we addressing that? And I think that the work of Broward, it's now becoming more of a collectivism is what we're really looking at, and holding one another accountable to the way we see families.
Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't know how much time we have. But I will say that I do not believe that blind removals is a colorblind policy. I believe that it is a blind procedure at a decision-making point. I agree that colorblind policies perpetuate racism. Because it's perpetuating this system of equality. We all know the difference between equity and equality. So that's a subtle difference between a colorblind policy versus a blind removal decision-making protocol. And I will say that I talk about the idea of universal goals and targeted strategies. So my approach to race equity is, when we finally build the system that we want, I think that system looks like what Corey's talking about. But until then, I think we need targeted strategies.
Molly, we're getting questions. Is there any effort at the federal level or at the level of organizations of state administrators to replicate these models nationwide? You might not have an answer to that question for these models in particular, Molly, but you are sitting in a seat where you are talking to a lot of child welfare leaders nationally, in a position to also guide them and consult them towards effective strategies. Is there any talk at the federal level? Is there any talk among state administrators, APHSA, about concrete interventions?
I can certainly speak to it in terms of states across the country. And as I said, I feel like people are being very dogged and intentional about naming this as an issue in their child welfare agencies, and thinking a lot about the early moments of what one might do. To Corey's point, the early moments are often consciousness raising, right? Like, we got to name it. We got to all understand what the heck it is we're talking about. The trick will be, of course, to transition into great, and what is it we're going to do? So I'm grateful that there is a drumbeat about these two programs we're hearing about today. And I am hopeful that that means folks who are listening in, who had maybe in the back of their minds another idea of another sort of structured way we could do about it, that this will give them the courage to tip and to write it down, talk to people about it. Corey, Jessica, we will talk with you about it. There's nothing more important to us. And that we are going to start to see a real groundswell of ways of being, ways of doing. And I'm noting the early question you had said, I can't remember who it was, but someone said, well, who do I advocate with if I want to bring a program like Jessica's or a program like Corey's? And I think, God, the answer is anybody you can find. Anybody, everybody, talk about it, right? Like, there should be no room we are in where this is not part of the conversation. And so the extent to which we are all doing that, I mean, there's 450 odd of us on this call right now. The extent to which all of us are doing that, well, that's, I don't know another way to make a tip.
Well, I mean, the group that we have on this call, not including our panelists, clearly, and all the attendees, are the right people. So that's a point well taken. And I got a question here from Teresa Mosier. Corey, Jessica, Molly, you can all take this, but is it difficult to scale up these models because of lack of funding, or is there a way to implement these models without increasing costs? I wouldn't imagine that, Jessica, what you're doing, what was done in Nassau is very costly, unless you start factoring in time or something. I don't know. And Corey, I mean, what about that cost question? Is this an issue of money, or is this an issue of will?
Go ahead, Jessica.
I will say that much of the costs in Nassau County were a series of trainings that they undertook for their staff. But I agree with you that it's more about will, because I don't think that it's a heavy lift, but I do think there is a level of training that's needed, and perhaps even TA for people who are adopting this as an experiment. They may need some targeted TA just for fidelity and tracking.
Corey?
So I feel that often we are sort of indoctrinated in white dominant, white led systems. We have to recognize that variable of being seen, right? So being seen creates a lot of fear. People in power hold power for purposes of usually power over, if we're talking about child welfare systems. So I believe that one, it can be and should be considered the way of work that transcends and will benefit all families eventually through prioritizing relationships over services. First piece, and it's measurable. So that the heavy lifting is the emotional sacrifices that are required in any adaptive work. So we know, Molly and I joked, it's been since 2016 since I've seen you, right? That's a long time ago. We're talking systems change before then.
Yep.
But this work is systems change. We're changing our internal mechanisms. We must change in order to create new conditions. So absolutely, it can be done. I think that we are in a position and have infinite collective power to do so, but we have to recognize that we may not see the gains we expect based on our cultural worldview of, neat, tidy little bow at the end of every agenda that we need. So we have to start to smash some of these normative views of how we process our systems change efforts. So short answer, absolutely. But I think it requires what Jessica said, a level of tenacity, risk taking, and will.
I can't resist. I totally agree with both of you. And I feel like this is a trap, is the word that comes to mind, that we often fall into when we talk about change in child welfare. The question comes, well, can we afford it? Right? Like, or how are we going to pay for it? That's how the question comes. How are we going to pay for it? Where are the resources coming from? And I feel like, to be clear, the cost of this cannot be measured in dollars. It's the wrong way to measure it. We have to measure it in the redistribution of power. And to Corey's point, people feel very strongly about the redistribution of power because we don't have enough experience in this country giving it away to learn that that's the only way it expands, right?
Absolutely.
Everyone is afraid to give it up because we feel that's going to be lost. It's not, it's always gain, but we don't have any practice at that. And so all the more point, projects like these that are helping us show, and here's how the practice played out. And the last thing I wanted to say about that is child welfare is under a lot of pressure to count things. How many kids this, how many parents that, how many this. And what we're talking about, Corey, Jessica, and I, is figuring out how to measure the absence of something. What if there were no Black children brought into foster care?
Right.
Like, and we have to figure out a way to see the absence of a number as a positive outcome. That's going to be really hard to do, and we should get started.
And I mean, and I just got to say just one thing is, as an observation, for years, I think what I have witnessed is that we don't have the tools for this conversation. So it gives us an opportunity to withdraw, right? We're used to having tools that exact the thing, the training that does this, the practice model that does this, the metrics that weigh this. It's going to take new capacities, new mindsets, and new muscle to create the tools we need for the system we want to see, to Jessica's point earlier. So fear less about what we may be lacking, and charge more about what we can do for ourselves, right?
Yeah, of course. You got Janice Avery here from Washington State, who's saying reducing the financial costs associated with placement frees dollars to build racially equitable practice models. Yes, I mean, I think, Molly, it's very well taken, though. Of course, our conception of child welfare funding is all about strictures. I mean, you look at how do we keep the entitlement from being run away, spending money to help families. That's not the priority. It's how do we keep the money down? Sorry, Molly, you were going to say something?
No, I just think it's the help. That's a tricky word, right? Like, because I think, yes, it is absolutely the case, Janice, reducing financial costs associated with placements frees dollars. But I really think I would encourage you to think about it as preserving your dollars and spending them only on things that work, right? Placement is not working for the great majority of children that are coming into foster care. They didn't need to come into foster care. Once they're in, it all sort of gets worse from there on out. And I think if we thought more about how we could spend dollars for more impact, and no, we could spend our dollars any way we want. You can move them around into 4B is the federal rules for funding is really broad. Like, you could spend your dollars in lots and lots of different ways, period.
I have a question from Lupe Grimaldi. Any data you can share with regard to these efforts and how Latino communities within child welfare have been affected? We've been talking a lot about, Black overrepresentation in the system. Interesting thing with Latino representation is, the protective factors, first generation Latinos are entering the system at low rates. Second generation, they're starting to enter in higher rates. By third generation, they're entering in the same rate as Black children. So at least that's data out of California showing that. So you've got this kind of degradation of family strengths over your duration of time in America, which I think is a crazy concept to think about what that means about being American. But that's a separate conversation. But have you guys looked at this in terms of entries for Latino children? Is there a place for that as well?
Well, I can say that during the blind removal pilot, Latino children, their percentage also went down. It wasn't as large as for the Black youth population. And it's also probably important to note that for white children, they actually increased the numbers of kids going into care, but it brought it from, they were underrepresented before. So it's kind of interesting that it brought it into proportion with their overall population. But that's how it was impacted with blind removals.
And, I see the question from Michelle, and I don't want to discount all non-white demographics of people. However, in Broward, it's a pretty diverse community. If you've ever been to South Florida, right, exactly what I mean. And many phenotypic Black people don't want to identify with American Blacks because of the myths that are associated with. But I'll say that in 2019, unfortunately, we saw an increase of the Latinx population grow in just a 6-month period, 215%. So absolutely, this particular way of being with families works for all cultures, but we specifically try with the Black community. And the CASA question here, I would say absolutely an asset, because currently,
can you read the question?
The question, my apologies, it's to the panelists. So the question is, can CASA volunteers be an asset or a hindrance to eliminating bias and changing these structures? This is a question. So I believe that CASA volunteers and Guardian Ad Litem volunteers across the country can be an asset. And it will require an examination of power and whiteness, right? So what we've done, so when you look at CASA, that whole mantra of who's more worthy or who should be better housed, better clothed, better fed, which is similar to the slaveability mantra of the 1800s, that worldview is pretty locked and it creates frozen policy, right? So CASA has a lot of power over decisions. And if that demographic of individuals were to begin to do less examining of Black and Brown, because Black and Brown people are the most studied, examined, experimented on, but the least understood, if CASA can begin to help our country move forward by naming this nameless condition we call racism, I think we would have a hell of a win there.
Anybody else want to weigh in on CASA? Jessica or Molly?
Oh, I totally agree. I just fill in the blank for CASA. Like any person who's on the anti-racist journey can positively influence what's happening in child welfare, right? Fill in the blank, right?
Yeah, and what I would add is people that are interested in blind removals are doing their composition of the blind removal committee in different ways. And many of them have talked about bringing community members into the committee, on the committee, or even CASA volunteers.
We're at that hour where we have to start thinking about winding down. Amazingly, I am so thrilled, Corey and Jessica, that you were able to present your work in such a cogent, clear, and rapid way, and that we were able to get to questions. I have been befuddled for some time now, and it is very nice to be able to have some ideas that we can work off of in a concrete way to move forward. I will ask each of you, given that we have roughly 300 people or so here listening in who all have power in their own ways, fill in the blank, what should we be doing next to try to eliminate, mitigate, and fight racism within the child welfare system? Jessica?
Sure, I highly recommend setting that universal goal within your agency. And to me, I just actually wrote a paper up on what Corey's doing in Broward County. So to me, that is the goal. That is the universal goal that we're trying to get to. But I will always say on that journey, Black and Brown youth are being harmed. They're being separated from their families. So I encourage you, even if it's not blind removals, do something about that juncture of family separation to make it so we can nullify the impact of systemic racism.
Corey?
I would say learn and do, because we're at this point where we can't just continue to learn, but we have to embrace the urgency of doing as well. But many leaders are unable to do because we haven't taken the time to really understand what it is we're facing and want to combat. So I would also say, and channel my dear friends here at Aaliyah, just expand your sphere of helpers, right? Like that is always a good idea with like-minded people because there's power in the collective, right? So we have inner and collective power. There's power in the collective, and we can do that together.
Ms. Tierney?
So the word urgency also came to my mind. And I think whether among us, there may be those who have stepped into the let's figure out this anti-racist thing. Among us may be people who are contemplating embarking on the journey. And to both, I would say this: it is more than a notion. It is so hard. And the idea that we are going to rewrite the way our country thinks about these things, that we're going to redistribute power in a way that is equitable and inclusive, I tell you, people feel some kind of way about that. And their pushback, I got a lot of pushback over the course of my career. There is no greater topic on which pushback has come, and it comes in hard, sometimes cruel ways. And so I would say to you, whether you're on the journey or getting on it, you are not alone. We are all in it together, and remember that all day, every day, because not a one of us can let up for a second.
With those words, I will thank Corey, Jessica, and Molly for being a part of this. I want to thank Accenture for making this possible and the work that Molly and her team does. Everybody who's on this, we're going to have a recording. We'll share links and whatnot. You know, if you're looking for more information about Nassau or Broward, you know, get in touch with us and we'll get you in touch with the right people. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.